Let me thank people to whom we are indeed grateful. That is, everyone who makes special contributions to our sponsorships, things which are outside of our regular budget, we really appreciate. And so I would like to thank, for sponsoring our reception this evening, our good friend Northrop Grumman. And our anonymous member for this evening's wine. And for sponsoring our cable television rebroadcast, which I remind you has potentially 1.7 million households in the network, the A.S. Abel Foundation. And that foundation was very helpful. It made sure that we did manage to balance our cable television budget during the past year, and we deeply appreciate that. Let me remind you, our next program has to do with rethinking our relationship with Russia. And James Goldgeier, professor at George Washington University, will be our guest. And a lot of you probably know his mother, who taught history at the Roland Park Country School. Not everybody does, but not everybody goes to Roland Park. But somebody must have a Roland Park connection. Our topic tonight is the American or United States-Arab relationship in a changing world. No one in this audience needs any comments about that world and how it's changing and the endless number of questions all of us have about it and the profound interest we have in it. But we are interested in improving our understanding of that circumstance. And to help us do that tonight, we're very, very fortunate to have one of the very seasoned former diplomats of the United States, the current president of the Middle East Institute, Ambassador Walker, with us tonight. We're absolutely delighted. Ambassador Walker is a graduate of Hamilton College, which is now vying for New York Times space with the Middle East, and has been for a while in its own unique way. But and his master's degree is from Boston University. He entered the State Department, the Foreign Service, in 1967. During the first half, or more than half of his career there, he was stationed in Syria and Tunisia, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, where he was Deputy Chief of Mission. He was a special assistant to the President's special assistant to Middle East, to the peace negotiations. He was a executive assistant to the Deputy Secretary of State and a Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs. More recently, he's been the United States Ambassador to the United Arab Emirates. He was then Deputy Permanent Representative to the United Nations, then Ambassador to Egypt, Ambassador to Israel, and then the Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs, which of course is the State Department person responsible for that particular region. After retiring, he became president and CEO of the Middle East Institute. He remains deeply involved and aware of what's going on in that region. I think he still writes a bi-weekly column for Al Hayek, the most widely read Arabic language newspaper in the world. So we have, in short, one of the State Department's most seasoned diplomats, one who holds the prestigious position of President of the Middle East Institute, deeply knowledgeable, experienced, and still involved. It's my great pleasure to welcome the Ambassador to the Council, and it's my great pleasure to introduce to you the Honorable Edward S. Walker.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. That resume keeps getting longer and longer. I don't know what happened here. Any event, I'm delighted to be here tonight, and I look forward to a good dialogue with you when we get to questions and answers, to cover the many questions that must be in your minds, and to listen to your comments as well. But I wanted to start with a story that's been making its rounds in Egypt lately, and it goes like this. My wife wants you to understand this is not something I made up. This is somebody else's entirely, because she thought it was a little bit. Anyway, the Saudi ambassador to the United Nations has just finished giving a speech, and he walks out into the lobby where he meets President Bush. They shake hands, and as they walk out, the Saudi says, "You know, I have one question about what I've seen in America." And President Bush says, "Well, Your Excellency, anything I can do to help you, I will do it." The Saudi then whispers to him, "My son watches this show, Star Trek, and in it there are Russians and blacks and Asians, but never any Arabs. He is very upset. He doesn't understand why there are never any Arabs in Star Trek." And President Bush laughs, and he leans towards the Saudi, and he whispers back, "It's because it takes place in the future." You can understand why my wife was a little hesitant on this one. But like most Egyptian jokes, this one reflects a prevailing attitude in Egypt, a sense that the United States dismisses the Arab world as if it is not there. In a recent poll of the region taken by Zagmi International, people were asked why they thought the United States had gone into Iraq. The overwhelming answers were, number one, oil, number two, to protect Israel, and number three, to dominate and weaken the Muslim world. Number one and two, I understood. Number three was a surprise to me when I saw that. This sense of American hostility comes from many sources. Partly it's a result of the local history of colonialism and the impression that we have taken over from the British and others in their efforts to exploit the region's resources, and to do so we must dominate it. Partly the fear comes from statements that have come out of some quarters of the United States that have demeaned Islam. Part comes from the war on terrorism, which appears to some in the region to be waged by Western secularists determined to wipe out religion. And finally, there are those who see the American program of building democracy in the region as a campaign to subvert local culture, traditions, and religions. These are the stereotypes that people have of us. The Arab states of the Middle East are strongly conservative. They're committed to their religion. A poll was taken this past summer that sought people's idea of the right balance between religion and government. In Jordan, 36% of the people said that religion should be respected but not dominant. However, 42% urged a greater role for the clergy in government. In Saudi Arabia, the result was similar. 33% said religion should be respected, and 48% said the clergy should be more involved. And this is a country where there is already great involvement by the clergy in society and in its government. Now, I cite these figures to demonstrate that significant numbers of people in this part of the world do not want a hard division between church and state. In fact, when asked about the role of Islam in the Middle East today, 55% of the people in Jordan said the role was too little. By contrast, 49% in Saudi Arabia said too little. That's a strange mix. But it would seem to indicate that the Saudis, by and large, are satisfied with the role religion plays in everyday life in Saudi Arabia. This is not the story of a suppressed majority which is yearning for the secular life, and it demonstrates that we need to tread carefully when we approach the questions of modernization and democratization in societies like Saudi Arabia and Jordan, lest we lose violent religious forces that neither the government nor we can control. It will be interesting to see the impact of the Iraqi elections and what they will do to the region. Up until the elections, 87% of the people in Jordan and 85% in Saudi Arabia said the Iraqi people were worse off because of our intervention. 71% of Jordanians and 90% of Saudis said it would result in more terrorism. 58% of Jordanians and 95% of Saudis said it would result in less democracy. Expectations were certainly not very high in the region. The Saudi region reaction on democracy was particularly surprising, since it seems to indicate that the average Saudi would welcome democracy in Iraq and feared that our intervention would be counterproductive. Some people have suggested that the Saudis, Jordanians, Egyptians, and others are afraid of democracy taking a foothold in the Arab world, as if democracy was a communicable disease. Sometimes one wishes that might be the case. If that were the case, Cuba would long ago become a democracy, and the Palestinians living cheek by jowl next to Israel would long before this have clipped Arafat's wings and demanded democracy. In reality, what the neighboring countries to Iraq fear the most is instability. If democracy can create greater stability in Iraq, then the Saudis, Jordanians, and others will welcome it. Why? Because what the governments of the region fear most is not democracy. It's the Zarqawis of this world, the terrorists, the religious extremists who want to re-engineer the Arab world in their own image. And many of these countries, Jordan, Egypt, Syria, Algeria, have much longer experience with terrorism of this kind than we do. When I was ambassador to Egypt in the early 90s, Egypt faced a major threat from homegrown terrorist organizations. These are the same organizations that ultimately joined with Osama bin Laden. They provided much of his leadership and his terrorist expertise. Most people in this country do not have a good idea about the genesis of this particular brand of fanaticism. After we had identified September 11th as having been perpetrated by bin Laden, and the majority of the attackers as having Saudi citizenship, many people grabbed onto the concept of Wahhabism, an austere brand of Saudi Islamic religious practice, as the motivating factor of the terrorists. Now, to be honest with you, I don't think many people in America knew what Wahhabi meant, and many still don't know, or how it related to bin Laden's ideology. But according to the 9/11 Commission report, the genesis of the ideology bin Laden was following was not Wahhabism, although certainly Wahhabism played a part in the role in his upbringing. But as the report states, quote, bin Laden relies heavily on the Egyptian writer Sayyid Qutb, a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, executed in 1966 on charges of attempting to overthrow the government, that's the government of Egypt. Qutb warned that more people, including Muslims, were attracted to material comforts than to his austere view of Islam. No middle ground existed for him or his followers, and unless Muslims took up arms in the fight, ignorance and materialism would win over Islam. The roots then of our problem with this kind of terrorism reside in early 20th century Egypt and in the Muslim Brotherhood. The Brotherhood is seeking respectability today, and it may actually be changing substantially, but its past has been marked by terrorist events in many Arab countries. As for bin Laden's philosophy, it comes from a perversion of Islam developed by al-Qutb in a jail cell in Egypt. It is a perversion that demands total identification with his vision of an austere life, and anyone or any government that does not agree is an apostate and fair game for violent elimination. These ideologies, these ideologues, the neo-Islamicists, are known, according to the 9/11 Commission, as takfiri. It's an Arabic term meaning those who define other Muslims as unbelievers. They represent an ideology that King Fahd of Saudi Arabia defined for the Islamic world a year ago as non-Islamic, a perversion of Islam, and anathema. Bin Laden's key lieutenant, Zawahiri, came from leading an Egyptian terrorist group when it was expelled from Egypt to Afghanistan in the mid-90s. Then it joined bin Laden. As for Saudi Arabia, it's been the target of much critical attention in the media. The Commission specifically refuted the allegations of the movie Fahrenheit 9/11 regarding the administration's alleged complicity in the departure of Saudis after the attack. I believe that Michael Moore was guilty of misrepresentation, exaggeration, not checking his facts, and using humor to cloak a political document. On the charge of financing terrorism, there is no doubt that individual Saudis, some wittingly and some not, have been implicated and that for many years the government of Saudi Arabia permitted this. But the Commission found no evidence of complicity by the government of Saudi Arabia in the financing terrorism in more recent times since September 11th. The Saudis came late to recognizing the problem. It took attacks in their own country about 2 years ago for the Saudi authorities to fully recognize that bin Laden and his supporters were not trying to create the Islamic Republic of America. They were trying to establish the Islamic Republic of Arabia. Recognition has now hit home, and from the reports I've had from friends in this administration, we have made great strides in working together on the problem of controlling the finances of terror. It's not an easy problem to deal with, as we've learned over the years in trying to control money laundering in the drug trade. And it may still be true that some individual Saudis funnel money to terrorist organizations, particularly Hamas in the occupied territories. It is also true that the cost of terrorism is not very high. While 9/11 was estimated to cost $400,000, the attack last year in Spain on the train was costed out at $1,000 or $2,000. And as the Commission pointed out, if Al-Qaeda is replaced by smaller, decentralized terrorist groups, the premise behind the government's efforts that terrorists need a financial support network may become outdated. Moreover, some terrorist operations do not rely on outside sources of money and may now be self-funding, either through legitimate employment or low-level criminal activity. Not a very encouraging prospect. The Saudis also recognize the need to deal with religious figures who preach hatred and support the perversion of which is called takfir. They have sent over 1,500 imams of local mosques for re-education. They've dismissed a number of them and arrested several others. 3 major advocates of terror recanted their positions on national television at the end of last year. Members of the royal family have come out strongly in opposition to this perversion of Islam, and the most senior religious figures in Saudi Arabia have publicly denounced this ideology as apostasy. It is important for the Saudis to make these points and to mount a campaign to gain support throughout the Islamic world from among respected Islamic religious authorities. This can have the most profound effect on getting rid of this perversion. Looking back at the President's inaugural address, he clearly stated the answer to the perversions of Islam is freedom. There's only one force of history that can break the reign of hatred and resentment and expose the pretensions of tyrants and reward the hopes of the decent and tolerant, and that is the force of human freedom. That was the President. If anyone needed evidence of this, they only had to look at the Iraqi election yesterday. It was a defining moment in the history of Iraq and of our intervention there. It was a clear message from the Iraqi people that they would never go back. They would never knuckle under again to the repression of a violent minority. This was also a lesson delivered by the minority Sunni Kurdish population, that a substantial minority in Iraq, some 20% of the population, can participate in the political process and protect their rights. This is a strong lesson for the inhabitants of the Sunni Triangle and its 20% of the Iraqi population. If the Iraqi people are seeking democracy as a route to stability and a better life, what about the other countries in the region? Of course, it differs quite a lot between countries. In Lebanon, 67% of the people support a system where people can openly criticize government, and 71% supported honest two-party elections. In Jordan, by contrast, only 32% support open criticism, and 28% two-party elections. This means there's still a long way to go. And many people in the United States would probably add that of the moderate countries in the region, Saudi Arabia has the furthest to go. But the tectonic plates of the region are shifting. There have been developments in Saudi Arabia that I would not have believed 3 years ago. Prince Saud al-Faisal, the Saudi foreign minister, addressing the Forum of the Future last year in December, said, "We in Saudi Arabia firmly believe that modernization and comprehensive political, economic, and social reforms are badly needed in our part of the world. We are fully aware that partial, minor, and isolated reforms or cosmetic changes are not sufficient in this regard. As evidence of progress in Saudi Arabia, he cited the fact that municipal elections for at least half the membership of each municipal council will be held by the end of this year. First popular elections in Saudi Arabia. He cited the expansion of the power of the Consultative Council to the point that it can initiate legislation. It is still very much controlled by the royal family, but it is a start. He cited the establishment of the Center for National Dialogue, in which Saudis of all walks of life and background, including women, are debating the future of Saudi Arabia. It is a fascinating dialogue that has been going from city to city, from conference to conference. The latest round has been a dialogue between male and female youth. He said that the establishment of an independent commission on human rights was an indication of where Saudi Arabia is going in the future. And they have initiated an independent public prosecution authority. Finally, economic reforms are taking place in Saudi Arabia to bring the country into compliance with the WTO. If you go to Saudi Arabia and talk in people's homes and the coffee shops, the talk is about reform, women's role in society, elections, and democracy. 5 years ago, 3 years ago, you would not have found that openness or that willingness to talk about these subjects. Saud al-Faisal added, when he was speaking to the Forum of the Future, there is no argument between us either regarding the universality of the values of liberty, equality, and fraternity, or the Jeffersonian democratic ideals or Wilsonian principle of self-determination. And that's the first time I've ever heard a senior Saudi member of the royal family talk about Jeffersonian democratic ideals. That is a significant change. As I said, the Saudis still have a long way to go. In a poll about women working outside the home, 9% of Jordanians said never. 21% of Egyptians said never, but 40% of Saudis said never. But if you look at the glass half full, well, that's the same thing as saying 60% of the Saudis said yes. So you have to look at the way you want to look at these things. But there is still a huge, gap in the region between countries and in progress. We're living in a very dynamic period in the Middle East, and it will be a challenge to support that dynamism in Iraq and in the rest of the region without adding to the aversion of the United States that's developed over the past few years. In March of this year, only 5% of all Jordanians had a favorable view of the United States. 81% of the people across the Middle East said the U.S. was partly responsible for the September 11th attacks. What these people were reflecting was the general view that the United States has turned its back on the Arabs and on the Palestinian problem in particular. People overwhelmingly says that it was American policies they objected to, not American values. In this regard, 86% of Saudis says it was our policies, and only 10% said our values. What they meant, according to the Zogby poll, which developed these figures, was that they respected American values, but they did not see American policy reflecting those values, and the big issue on most of their minds was Palestine. If you read the testimony that Secretary Rice gave in her confirmation hearings, you might notice that there's been a major shift in the administration when it comes to its attitude towards the Palestinian issue. I do not expect this president to convert and become Bill Clinton on the issue, but Secretary Rice made it very clear that the administration would be actively engaged. When coupled with her remarks on our future actions with our allies, our willingness to listen, and our approach to Iraq, it seems to me that we may be paying attention to the sage advice: when you're in a hole, stop digging. Maybe we have now stopped digging and are starting to fill in that hole. Thank you very much.
When do you apologize to certain people for the price they've paid?
I don't know that you can apologize. I don't know that you could ever. Wait a minute. No, I know, he did. Yeah, I agree with you 100% that it is the role of the president and the role of this government to not only recognize the sacrifice, but to reward the people that have sacrificed. I think it's appalling at some of the treatment that our reservists have gotten by paychecks not coming through and armor, not having the armor they needed to do the job. I was always somewhat critical of the way we went into this war, and I don't apologize for that in a sense, in any sense. But I do have to say we are where we are, and now is there a way to turn this to our benefit as a country and to make the situation better than it was? I am still skeptical of the Saudi behavior. I'm skeptical of the Palestinians. I'm skeptical of the administration. But the signals in each of these cases has changed somewhat. And being a professional diplomat, you always have to look at the glass half full. Now, that may not be very good, but for 35 years, I tried to do my best to help the Palestinians and Israelis come together and the Arabs and Israelis come together. Well, you know, I haven't been all that successful. It may be that I'm not that good a diplomat, but I've never given up. And I don't think we can, as a country, give up, because I think our future is involved with the rest of the world, and what we do is important. Now, I would like us to stand up for our values and to live up to our values, and I think it's appalling when we have something happening like Abu Ghraib. And I don't think it is the fault of the young men and women. I think it is an environment that has taken place. It's an unfortunate environment. But I can tell you one thing. It makes job of an ambassador virtually impossible. How do I go to Hosni Mubarak and tell him that we cannot accept that you have detention without trial, that you have military tribunals, that you send people to their deaths without due process and so on? How can I do that as an ambassador when you're getting in the newspapers all this material about what we have done? We have a lot of work to do, and it's people like you that can help change the way things are going. I heard Condi too, and I heard her say that we have learned lessons. Well, let's hope so. Let's hope that we've learned lessons. Please.
The question is, why not have a dialogue in which various American religious groups dialogued with the Saudis?
I think the questioner pointed out some of the similarities that exist between the average Saudi citizen who has his set sense of family values and traditions and so on, and his commitment to religion, and the average American who has many of these same values. It's true that when you do polling of the Arab world, you find that people have very many of the same values that we do. The differences aren't that great. Furthermore, I would say that the Saudis are probably closer to the red states than some of us in the blue states are. So I think the idea is terrific. I think it would be very healthy and very helpful to have this kind of a dialogue. I know that there are a number of religious figures in this country who are trying to do just this type of thing, not specifically with the Saudis. When I was ambassador to Egypt, I tried to get the Egyptian religious authorities to come together with Jewish religious authorities and Christian religious authorities. And there was a lot of receptivity on their part. I think I had the hardest time with our government because you never know who's going to represent the Christians and who's going to represent the Jews. And you start getting such a large number of people that need to be brought in that you lose the dialogue. But I think that a quiet dialogue between people would be very valuable.
How do our legislators let someone be nominated for Attorney General who is guilty, according to the premise, of affiliations with some of the bad behavior in various prisons?
I think the legislature basically did not pursue its responsibilities at that time or at this time. But I will say it was not just the legislature. It was also the press. The press gave the administration a complete buy in the move up to the invasion. And I've had sessions with top editors of New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and so on. They too feel that they didn't do their job. And they are very concerned about how that breakdown occurred. And we were in a session with Egyptians going back and forth with Egyptian journalists, and it was a fascinating session because the Egyptians were sitting there criticizing themselves and the Americans were sitting there criticizing themselves, and we both learned an awful lot. So our press has to do a better job. Our non-governmental organizations were too quiet when it comes to this kind of thing. There is a certain intimidation that takes place and also affects fundraising and so on. So we all have a responsibility to do a better job in checking. Otherwise, the checks and balances of our system don't work. Yes, ma'am.
The question is, how would you unravel American seriousness with respect to democracy and its basic values and its interests?
Well, you raised the issue of Al Jazeera, and as you know, the American administration has taken great exception to a lot of the reporting that's taken place on Al Jazeera. At the same time, the UNDP report cited, done by Arabs, cited Al Jazeera as bringing a fresh look and fresh air into the media environment in the Middle East, and cited it as a very positive influence. Both things are probably true because there are certainly excesses on the part of Al Jazeera reporting, and there are times when it goes beyond what I would call responsible journalism. But it is a young organization. It is learning its way, and of course, freedom of speech means that the administration can also make its points about Al Jazeera, as long as they aren't accompanied by force. But I think it is a problem in the Middle East to, and I've seen it in Egyptian newspapers and so on, to strike this balance between freedom of speech and responsibility. I have seen it skewed in certain journals where slander, libel, and so on take place, and nobody pays attention to it, where articles are sold. I mean, I used to be able to in Egypt, I didn't, but the German embassy, I recall, used to buy articles that were favorable to them, and they were reported as news. Now, I see that that's happened here too, but it's so we all have our guilt and our problems. But it is very hard to stand up for these principles unless we're standing up for them. And I think that when we start putting in the official radio of Iraq, and we exclude Al Arabiya and Al Jazeera, I think we're probably making a mistake. Now, my solution is don't exclude them, use them. I can tell you that Al Jazeera would welcome any number of administration officials anytime, day or night, to go on Al Jazeera and explain America's position. I have done it myself many times. And, you know, sure, you're going to get people on there who are ranting and raving and saying America's terrible and so on, but if that's all people are hearing, then that's really bad, whereas we have the capability to make it much more balanced just by our own intervention, all the way in the back there.
The question is, how difficult is it to have a Palestinian state when you have a large number of Israeli settlements on the West Bank? The general question is, how do you determine what the territorial divisions are going to be? Would you comment on that, please?
Yeah, the plan that Sharon has put out includes, of course, all the settlers in the Gaza Strip will leave. And at the same time, it includes 4 settlements in the heartland of the Palestinian area that will also leave. I might add that there's a lot of other things that need to be done as well. But no one has said that that's the only 4 settlements that will have to leave in a peace agreement. What they're basically saying is this is a start. What the administration is saying and what Sharon has said is that we will then be in a position to move to the roadmap, and that a process will start based on a new beginning in the relationship between the Palestinians and the Israelis, where confidence is beginning to be restored. That's already beginning to happen. What the final borders will look like and where the final settlements will be, will still have to be perceived. What Secretary Rice said was, when asked this question in their confirmation hearing, was, well, there have been negotiations about these subjects and we have come a certain way. She didn't say we're going to start right from the same spot, but she implied that we could look back to where they got in Camp David and then subsequently as a sort of a guideline. She also said that any Palestinian state has to be viable and it can't be carved up into little pieces. So it's not clear yet where the administration is going. But it may well be that if we can move along the line that's already projected towards withdrawal and towards cooperation on security. I mean, we have now returned to the situation where Americans and Palestinians and Israeli security people are working together, finally, after a long time. So this is hopeful. I've been around too long to over-exaggerate the hope, and I've seen it dashed too many times, but I'm marginally hopeful. Yes, sir. Yes.
Would you comment upon American involvement in policies of aid that may be helpful in undercutting underlying problems of terrorism and discontent?
You know, we've never really, as far as I know, done an exhaustive study of why people are willing to kill themselves in the name of some cause. What is it that does this? We got, you know, after September 11th, people ask the question, why do they hate us? But they never really ask the question, why does a person, a young man with his whole future in front of him, or a young woman, as has occurred in the Palestinian areas, why are they willing to do this? And I think it's a terribly important question because, and we shouldn't be shy of it. When we first looked at it, I think people were worried that we might find that there were certain contributing factors that came from the West or from our history and so on, and we really didn't want to face those. But it's time to face it. It's time to face it now. When I was in Egypt in the mid-90s, they had a terrible terrorism problem. And we were helping the Egyptian government through our CIA to bring this problem under control. We weren't very smart about it because what we did was we helped them so much that they kicked the terrorists out and they all went to Afghanistan and joined bin Laden. But so you never know, unintended consequences. But we did an investigation with the Egyptians as to who were these terrorists and what were the essential problems. Well, first of all, they weren't poor. They came from sort of middle-class families. And second of all, they tended to be either from the poorest sections or, you know, of Cairo, even though their families were not the poorest people, or from the southern Egypt. And southern Egypt and the poor sections of Cairo had been bypassed for the government for generations. Cairo government focuses on Cairo, the places where the upper class live and so on. So there was a presumption that the government wasn't going to do anything for them and couldn't help them. Third, their families had struggled and they had worked hard to get into universities in the southern Egyptian areas. And they went to university and they worked for 4 years and they did well and they came out and they had no jobs to go to. And in Egypt, if you don't have a job, you can't afford to buy an apartment. If you can't afford to buy an apartment, you can't get married. If you can't get married, you can't have children. Your entire life, what's there? What's out there for you? Is that frustration. And then you combine it with the fact that the only place, at least in some of these areas, that you can go and vent is the mosque. Where you can have relative confidence that the secret police aren't there. And so they go to the mosque and they get together with other people who don't have jobs, other young men, and there is a recruiter in from Afghanistan. And a recruiter starts, you know, proselytizing, bring them along. And so some of them, not a majority, but some of them volunteer to go to Afghanistan and go through the terrorist training camps, and they become a part of Al-Qaeda or a part of the Islamic Jihad in Egypt. And, you know, there are so many points along the way where you could stop this process. Now, there are always going to be some people that, you know, will turn to this kind of thing. There are in this country as well. But this general problem, which I think is much broader than on an individual base, we can do something about, and we should. Now, the problem with large sums of money is we're not very good at spending it. And if you look at all the money we have put into Egypt over the years, neither they nor we have been particularly good at making the right investments that would really bring the Egyptian economy up and create jobs. And jobs is the secret. Jobs was a secret in Iraq, still is. It's a secret throughout the whole Arab world where 20% unemployment exists virtually everywhere. Yes, sir.
Mr. Shore's humorous question is if indeed the president is correct that some people hate us because we have freedom, should we then not reduce our freedom to a level where people are no longer unhappy with it?
I like the premise. However, I have to disagree with our president, because I don't believe that the figures and the facts and the polling ever indicates that it's freedom that people are worried about. Freedom people want. And I think that's pretty consistent throughout the Arab world. They don't want chaos, and they want to have freedom, but they want to grow into freedom. And freedom is something that you just can't snap your fingers and have an election and have it all work. It takes time. As Condi said, a very, very, very long time in some cases. But it can be done. And it's not, certainly the people do not think badly of our values. As the foreign minister of Saudi Arabia said, what we stand for is what they would like to stand for. So it's not that they hate our freedom. It's not that they hate our democracy. They do have some serious doubts about whether we love our freedom and our democracy and our values. And that's what we have to work on. Yes.
The question is whether the neoconservatives are a perversion or a twist somehow on Christianity.
Look, there is, I am a firm believer that fundamentalists are perfectly legitimate. You know, they have every right to believe what they believe. And that doesn't matter whether it's a Christian fundamentalist, a Jewish fundamentalist, or a Muslim fundamentalist. The problem is not fundamentalism. The problem is a change that takes place among some to include, well, if you don't believe what I believe, you don't deserve to live. And I don't see the neoconservatives saying that in any sense of the word. You might challenge some people in the who have attacked abortion clinics, for example. You might say that these people have stepped over the line, and I think you would be right to say that. But as long as you are trying to express your opinions and express your beliefs, and you're doing it through peaceful means, you have every right to do it in this country, and certainly we ought to be encouraging that everywhere else. So it's not the problem of neoconservatives, it's not the problem of fundamentalists, it's the problem of going beyond the line.
Would you comment on or speculate on the future of American relations and policy toward Iran?
Yeah, somehow we have gotten ourselves in a position, and the Europeans have gotten themselves in the position of reversing roles, at least reversing the roles we should be playing. We have very little leverage over the Iranians. We have sanctions all over the place. There's no more sanctions you can put on them. We have this implicit threat of military action that is fed from time to time by leaks out of the Pentagon or somewhere else. But we can't put many more. We cannot enforce anything on the Iranians. They've discounted everything we've done. The Europeans, on the other hand, and we're playing the bad guy. Europeans, however, do have leverage. They have a lot of leverage. They've got enormous economic leverage on the Iranians. Iranians need the European market. And yet, here we are being a bad cop with no leverage, and the Europeans are being the good cop with all the leverage. we've got to get back to basics with the Europeans, and we've got to recognize that this is a common problem, and we've got to work together to resolve it. I don't know. I think a lot of people are not convinced that Khatami is a Democrat with a small d. And people are hopeful that there will be changes in Iran. But the immediate problem, one of the development of nuclear weapons and so on, is not going away. I mean, it would have been there if the Shah had still been in power. But as people say, it's not so much who has the weapons, it's who's got their fingers on the trigger. And I think we do have to do something about this. But it's not going to be done. It's not going to be done, as you say, through military means in all probability. First of all, we are fully engaged in Iraq. We just don't have any more reservists to throw at the problem. It is very doubtful that air attack is going to have an effective impact on Iranian nuclear capabilities. It would unleash forces in the region and in Europe and so on that could be counterproductive for us. It could create a situation in which Hezbollah was unleashed and Israel was facing a lot of new attacks and so on. It is a risky business. And if we can find another way to do it, then we damn well ought to find another way to do it. And if that means getting the Europeans, and talking Turkey to them and going to the Security Council and getting international sanctions, which would be effective, then that's what we ought to be doing.
Why are we afraid of al-Qaeda? Have we overreacted?
One of the problems we have is you're talking about asymmetrical warfare, and it is a very complicated, difficult proposition to deal with conventional forces. We are still in many respects fighting the last war. We are still configured to fight a land war in Europe. We are not configured for nation building. We are not configured for a very robust but light type of reaction to this kind of thing. And we really need to do some serious thinking about changing the way we look at warfare if we're going to deal with these problems in countries like Iraq and so on. We need a much stronger capability to train police. Many years ago, I remember we used to have training facilities for police, and then we had a problem because somebody we trained did some horrible things, and so Congress cut out the facilities. I think we got to look at that again. We have to have police training capabilities for foreign police officers. The Canadians, when we go into Haiti and we're trying to restore stability there, we don't have any police that we can send to Haiti. All of our police are totally committed. Either they're committed, the military police in military functions and jobs, or our civilian police don't have a reserve capability in order to send people. The Canadians do. They have a system in which they can send Mounties down to Haiti and to provide some of the policing. We don't train our soldiers in any sense for peacekeeping missions. Other countries do, we don't. And yet, peacekeeping missions can get you can stop some of these confrontations from going to the point where you really have a loss of all stability and you have chaos. I think we've got to take a very hard look at what we're doing with this enormous amount of money we're spending and reposition some of it. And I think at this point we're just beginning to see maybe the government starting to focus on this. They've established an office in the State Department now to look at this problem. Yes, ma'am. This is a fundamental problem. You cannot have peace if everybody's shouting to kill each other. So one of the things that we missed in going up to Camp David was we didn't set the stage. We didn't do the groundwork necessary, and the Palestinians certainly didn't, for their people to accept an agreement. They were still saying, we want everything. You can't have anything. And they were still saying, kill the Jews and some of their thing. Well, you're never going to get anywhere as long as that takes place. We started to think about it in the Y conference when we agreed to establish an incitement committee, an anti-incitement committee between the Palestinians and the Israelis. Only problem was that nobody at the highest levels gave it any support. And Iraq wanted to go off and work with the Syrians. Our own government tried for a little while, but really didn't pursue it. I have gone and made demarches. I have talked to the Egyptian press. I've talked to editors there. I've talked to members of Congress, and every once in a while you can build up enough pressure for there to be an impact, and suddenly for a month or two, the horrible cartoons that occur and the statements in the newspapers that occur die down. But we don't continue. We don't continue it. And because people lose interest, because it's hard to get people to do the same thing unless you have a very committed group of people that have nothing else really to do. And I would say, and I'll be blunt on this, I've tried to get the ADL to get involved in this, and I can't get them to engage in this. Now, that's not principally their job. I agree, and I understand that. Their job is here. But we need to have people taking this issue seriously. I was pleased to see at least it was referred to in the testimony that Condi gave.
How hard should you embrace the Arab world to solve our problems?
Well, I don't think the question is how tightly you embrace them. I think the real question is whether you listen to them. I mean, the big problem that we have is that we do tend to tell the rest of the world how to behave. And we tend to, we project a certain arrogance. Now, I think it's in good intention. I don't think we have any bad intentions in this approach. But I do think that people really object to it. They want to be heard. They want their culture factored in. They want to have a sense that indeed we understand them, or we're trying to understand them. In return, then, they would try, I hope, harder to understand us. I had a full year effort with the Al Ahram Center in Egypt, in Cairo, in which we tried to examine this question of the relationship between Arabs and Americans. And I can tell you that was some of the hardest job I've ever had. I mean, we didn't even speak, it's not the fact it's Arabic. We still didn't speak the same language even when we were speaking English, because the culture gap was so great. The fact is that we talked past each other for a lot of the time. We tried to write a common report. That was an impossible task. And we finally wrote a report where we tried to outline what each of us felt. But there's an enormous effort involved, and it's enormously productive. I think we both came out of it with a better sense of what the other was about and what our problems were. And we even came out with some ideas of how do you solve it. So not so much tightening the embrace, that might even be counterproductive, but really listening more attentively and factoring in other people's views into your approach to problems. And the second question was?
Evolution of Saudi.
The Saudi regime, the society.
There are always going to be ups and downs in this kind of thing. But one of the things that I think has happened in Iraq, for example, is because of the opening that has taken place and because of the election, I don't think the Iraqis can ever go back. I think once you start opening the door is open. It's not something you just clamp shut again. And I think the same thing is happening in Saudi Arabia. The door is open. People are saying things they wouldn't have said, they would have been afraid to say 3 years ago. I was in Saudi at the same time. I never heard people criticizing the royal family. I heard it now, I hear it now when I go over there. I hear royals criticizing the royal family. And some of them are very liberal in their viewpoints. It's a much more dynamic society than it used to be. Now, it's going to take a lot of more effort. As I say, they've got a longer road to go than some of the other countries in the region. I would suspect the Palestinians will be way ahead of them in having a democracy long before the Saudis do, because I think the Palestinians are ready for it. And probably even the Iraqis, although that's But yeah, I think it's possible, and I think if we treat it rationally, and if we keep a certain amount of pressure on and a certain amount of support in our relationship, that the Saudis will accommodate. They'll accommodate for one reason, because it's in their interest. The Saudi royal family cannot survive on into next generations the way they're going. They aren't creating jobs. They aren't educating their young. People ultimately won't accept that. And the top leadership understands this. They don't know exactly how to go about it, but they understand this. So that's why I feel pretty confident that it is going to evolve and that we will see 10 years from now a totally different Saudi Arabia than we see today.
The statement was that Tom Friedman has suggested there'll be more unemployed Saudi young men in the future than there are now. And the question was, what do we do about that?
Well, clearly, if the current situation continues, you will have that, and then it'll be an unsustainable society, and that's what I was saying. The leadership in Saudi Arabia has to recognize this fact, that you cannot continue to mismanage the education of your young people so that they can't engage in the modern technology and the modern world and the business and so on. And you have to be able to create jobs. That means there are going to be significant reforms in the economy. It means there are going to be significant reforms in the education system. And if you then start to create the jobs and so on, the premise is wrong. But Tom is quite right. Extrapolate out from today and don't do anything to change the situation. And you'll have an untenable situation, and there will be twice as many people unemployed as working.
What does America do?
Well, I think this is one the Saudis have to do. What we do is we help the Saudis work through their problems with the WTO, for example, so that they make the right kind of economic reforms. We encourage them to diversify their country's industry. We stop thinking of them as a sole supporter of oil, and we start thinking of them as a regular country and try and establish our relationship on that basis, rather than constantly being related only because of oil production or weapons sales. It's a very false, very shallow kind of relationship. So we need to make it a much more complex relationship.
Unfortunately, we have to deal with our rigid schedule of 7:10. But Mr. Ambassador, you've been extraordinarily generous with your sharing of your time.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you all.
Thanks, Burd.